The sun had just risen in the east, casting golden light over the bustling streets of downtown. The blaring horns, hurried footsteps, and lively conversations formed the city's usual rhythmic hustle. Yet beneath the surface of this vibrant chaos, the city harbored unspoken tensions that few dared to acknowledge. Carter, a middle-aged police officer with piercing eyes, patrolled the familiar streets, proud of his strictness and resolve in his work. Carter carried an ingrained bias he couldn't shake. To him, anyone who didn't fit the norm was a potential threat. Particularly, he viewed black individuals as dangerous, lazy, and prone to trouble. As he turned a corner, Carter spotted an elderly black man, likely in his 70s, leaning against a lamppost. The man was dressed simply, a white shirt that had yellowed with age, worn khaki pants, and scuffed shoes. In his hand, he held a small paper bag. The old man seemed to be looking around, as if waiting for something. Carter stopped, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "What are you doing here?" Carter asked, his voice sharp and cold. The old man looked up, his gaze calm. "I'm just waiting for my son. He's coming to pick me up." "Your son? What's his name? What does he do? Do you have ID?" Carter pressed, his tone growing more insistent. Walter, the elderly man, furrowed his brow slightly but kept his voice steady. "Please, calm down. I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm just standing here, waiting." To Carter, this response only fueled his suspicion. Not doing anything wrong? Who knows? Standing here like this, looking shady. Why should anyone believe that? Carter stepped closer, his eyes scanning Walter from head to toe. A few passers-by began to take notice, but no one dared to intervene. Walter took a deep breath, his expression tinged with weariness. "I don't want any trouble. If you'd like, I can show you my ID." Carter waved dismissively, signaling that it wasn't necessary. But deep down, he had already made up his mind. Something about this old man wasn't right. "Come with me to the station for a check," Carter ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. Walter shook his head, feeling it unnecessary to argue with a young officer wielding so much power. "I don't think this needs to go that far. I'm just waiting for my son." But Carter had lost his patience. He strode forward, grabbing Walter's arm and forcing the elderly man to stand upright. The sudden action startled the surrounding crowd. A young woman stopped in her tracks, pulling out her phone to record. Carter, however, was unfazed. He felt compelled to teach the old man a lesson for daring to question him. "What are you doing?" Walter asked, his voice still calm but now tinged with irritation. "No questions. You're coming with me to the station," Carter barked, yanking Walter's arm with such force that the man lost his balance. Walter fell onto the concrete pavement, his hand striking a lamppost and leaving a trickle of blood. "Stop that!" a voice called out from the crowd. The young woman recording the incident stepped forward. "You can't do this. He hasn't done anything wrong." "Get out of here," Carter shouted back. "This is none of your business." But Carter's actions had already drawn widespread attention. Several people began recording the scene with their phones, while others started calling the police. Walter slowly got to his feet, wiping the blood from his hand. He looked at Carter with a weary expression. "Have you ever stopped to think that you might be wrong?" he asked, his voice low but steady enough for Carter to hear. Carter didn't respond. He quickly escorted Walter into the patrol car, ignoring the disapproving stares and murmurs around him. In his mind, this was just another routine day at work. The following day, the video of Carter's confrontation with Walter went viral across social media, with the sensational headline, "Police officer assaults elderly black man for simply waiting on the street." The clip garnered hundreds of thousands of views within hours. The comments section exploded. "This is exactly why we need police reform. They have zero respect for human rights. This is blatant racism." However, there were also those who defended Carter. He looked suspicious. The cop was just doing his job. We don't know the full story. Meanwhile, Carter found himself under intense scrutiny from his superiors. Do you have any idea what you've done? The police chief bellowed during a meeting. That video is destroying the reputation of the entire department. I didn't do anything wrong, Carter retorted loudly. The guy looked suspicious. Suspicious isn't a justification for you to act so aggressively. Now we're dealing with an entire wave of public outrage. The chief shot back. While public outrage raged on, Walter lay in his hospital bed, his bandaged hand a testament to the physical harm he endured. But the pain in his heart was far greater. He scrolled through messages on his phone from his son, David Johnson, the Minister of Justice. David, powerful yet reserved man, was furious when he learned of the attack on his father. He called immediately. Dad, are you okay? I'm not going to let them get away with this. Walter sighed deeply. David, there's no need to escalate this. I'm not looking for revenge. I just want them to understand they were wrong. David clenched his fist. This isn't just about you, Dad. This is about the entire community. I won't let this slide. But justice isn't revenge. David, Walter emphasized. If you truly want to help me, act in a way that's right. David fell silent for a moment. He knew his father to be a wise and compassionate man. But this time, he wasn't sure if he could follow his advice. News of the incident quickly captured national media attention. From major television networks to small blogs on social media, everyone was covering the shocking video. The footage of Carter using force against Walter was replayed endlessly on every channel, becoming the focal point of public outrage. On an evening news program, the anchor emphasized, "We are witnessing a blatant case of racial bias within the police force. Mr. Walter, an elderly man who posed no threat, was assaulted based on baseless prejudice. The question is, when will this stop?" Carter sat in his living room, watching the broadcast as the accusations rolled in. His face darkened, and he clenched the beer can in his hand. "They don't know the full story," he muttered. "I was just doing my job." His wife, Linda, tried to console him. "Carter, maybe you should stay quiet for a while. Don't let the media provoke you." "Stay quiet? Why should I stay quiet? I didn't do anything wrong," Carter snapped, pacing angrily around the room. Yet deep down, a growing fear gnawed at him. The judgmental looks from his colleagues, the whispers in the precinct, and the mounting pressure from the media were beginning to suffocate him. Meanwhile, Walter was still resting in the hospital. He was surprised by the overwhelming public support he received. A female reporter called, asking for an interview. "Mr. Walter, the public wants to know how you feel about the incident." Walter gently declined. "Thank you, but I don't want to escalate the situation further. I just want the truth to come to light." However, Walter's refusal didn't stop the wildfire of public outrage from spreading. As public outrage continued to simmer, the police department was forced to launch an internal investigation to calm the public. Carter was summoned to the police chief's office. The room felt stifling under the harsh white light of the overhead lamp. The police chief, a middle-aged man with piercing eyes, sat across from Carter, flipping through pages of a thick file. "Carter," he began, his voice low but stern, "do you have any idea how serious this is? The department is under heavy public scrutiny." "I was just following protocol," Carter argued. That old man looked suspicious. "I don't think I did anything wrong." "Suspicious?" The chief raised an eyebrow. "I've seen the video. There's no indication he posed any danger. Your actions were not only wrong but have also damaged the reputation of the entire force." Carter tried to defend himself. "But he wasn't cooperating. If I hadn't taken action, who knows what could have happened?" The chief shook his head and sighed. "That's no excuse for using force. You should know better. This incident is being taken very seriously. I suggest you prepare yourself." The investigation unfolded under tense conditions. Witnesses were summoned, and every frame of the video was scrutinized. Some of Carter's colleagues quietly supported him. but others remained silent. Carter began to feel isolated, as though the entire world was turning against him. While the police department scrambled to manage the situation, David Johnson, Walter's son, launched his own investigation. As the Attorney General, David wielded the power and connections necessary to uncover the truth. He instructed his assistant to gather all available information about Carter. After a few days, a thick report was placed on his desk. David opened it and began reading. He discovered that Carter was far from the exemplary officer he claimed to be. In the past, Carter had faced multiple allegations of abuse of power, but most of the cases had been swept under the rug thanks to cover-ups by his superiors. David clenched his fists. "So this wasn't the first time," he said, his tone cold and steely. Furthermore, David uncovered numerous instances where Carter had been involved in misconduct, the majority of which involved black victims. These wrongful acts had never been punished, fueling David's resolve to expose the truth. Meanwhile, Walter remained calm and composed, unaware of what his son was doing. When David visited him at the hospital, Walter asked, "What are you planning to do?" David responded candidly, "I'm going to expose everything, not just for you, but for all the other victims." Walter sighed, his gaze thoughtful. "I just hope this ends peacefully. Don't let anger cloud your judgment, my son." As the investigation continued, public pressure intensified. Protests erupted across the city, with people carrying signs and chanting slogans demanding justice for Walter and other victims. "No more room for injustice. End racism now." From inside his home, Carter looked out the window at the crowd gathered outside the police station. The protest signs and chants made him feel increasingly cornered. His wife, Linda, tried to reason with him. "Carter, you need to apologize. A simple apology could ease the tension." "Apologize?" Carter scoffed bitterly. "I didn't do anything wrong. I won't bow down to that mob." Meanwhile, David Johnson quietly collaborated with human rights organizations to prepare a case against Carter and the police department. Documents were compiled, and former victims of Carter began to come forward as witnesses. They shared accounts of the abuse they had suffered at his hands, recounting both the physical and emotional scars they endured. The growing pressure made it impossible for the police department to contain the situation. The police chief was forced to announce to the press that Carter would be suspended pending further investigation. However, this measure did little to quell public outrage. The protests continued to swell, with all eyes fixed on Carter. Inside the quiet hospital room, soft light from the window bathed Walter's calm face. He gazed at his son, David, who stood in the corner of the room, his face clearly etched with tension. David had just finished a lengthy phone call with his legal team. Despite having solid evidence in hand, he couldn't conceal the unease he felt. "David," Walter called softly, drawing his son's attention. "What do you plan to do next?" David stepped closer, taking a seat beside his father's bed. He paused in thought before answering. "I'm going to bring everything to light, not just Carter, but the entire police system that enabled him. This isn't just about justice for you, Dad. It's for everyone who's ever been a victim of injustice." Walter sighed gently, his aged hand resting on David's. "I understand your anger, David, but I don't want that anger to become the driving force behind your actions. Remember, justice should never be fueled by revenge." David frowned slightly. "Dad, this isn't about revenge. It's about responsibility. As someone who upholds the law, I can't let this slide without taking action." "You're right," Walter nodded. "But tread carefully. Hatred can cloud your vision, and you might miss the bigger picture." David looked deeply into his father's eyes. While he understood the wisdom in Walter's words, the fire of indignation still burned within him. Clenching his fist, he responded firmly, "I promise to do everything within the bounds of the law. But rest assured, Dad, I won't stop until the truth is fully exposed." While David and Walter worked to keep everything within the bounds of the law, the situation outside grew increasingly tense. Protests spread from the city center to neighboring areas, with citizens demanding decisive action from the authorities. Chants of "Justice for Walter" echoed louder and more frequently. One evening, as Carter left the police station after a long and exhausting day, he was ambushed in the parking lot by a group of enraged protesters. Shouts, accusations, and the glaring lights of phone cameras surrounded him. "We know who you are," a man yelled. "You're going to pay for what you've done." Before Carter could respond, someone in the crowd threw a beer can at him. It struck his shoulder, causing him to stumble. Others in the group began advancing toward him, their eyes filled with anger. For the first time, Carter felt a deep and genuine fear. He reached for his phone to call for backup, but he was shoved to the ground. The group continued shouting, their aggression escalating. However, before the situation could spiral completely out of control, a few bystanders intervened. They pulled the angry protesters away, creating enough space for Carter to get back on his feet. The incident left Carter shaken to his core. He never imagined that he, a police officer, would become the hunted. As he drove home with a pale and fearful face, he couldn't stop the thought racing through his mind. How did it come to this? The next morning, an emergency meeting was convened at City Hall, attended by the mayor, police chief, and other key stakeholders. David Johnson, in his capacity as Attorney General, was also present. The room buzzed with tension as all eyes turned to David. "Ladies and gentlemen," David began, his voice steady and authoritative. "This incident is not merely about the misconduct of one individual. It is a symptom of a much larger issue: systemic negligence and abuse of power within our police force." The police chief cleared his throat, attempting to justify his actions. "We have launched an internal investigation and suspended Officer Carter. I believe this should be sufficient to reassure the public." "Suspension is not enough," David countered sharply. "Suspension is a temporary measure. What we need is real action to bring about systemic change. Without that, officers like Carter will continue to exploit their power." The mayor, a stout man in an expensive suit, interjected. "Mr. Johnson, we understand your concerns. However, we also have to consider the stability of the city. These protests are causing significant disruption. If we don't manage the situation carefully, things could spiral out of control." David turned to the mayor, his gaze piercing. "Stability cannot be achieved by sweeping the truth under the rug. Remember, it's precisely this kind of unchecked abuse that brought us to this point." The meeting ended on a heavy note. But one thing was clear: David had no intention of backing down. While the heated debates continued, an unexpected development occurred. Carter's colleague, Officer Ryan, decided to come forward. Ryan had witnessed many instances of Carter abusing his power but had always remained silent out of fear for his career. However, after the incident with Walter, Ryan could no longer stand idly by. Ryan met David in a private meeting. "I want to tell the truth," he said, his voice trembling. "I've seen Carter use unnecessary force multiple times. He always targets people of color." David looked at Ryan, his expression showing surprise. "Why are you speaking up now?" Ryan lowered his head, his face filled with regret. "I was afraid of losing my job, of being ostracized. But I can't stay silent any longer." Ryan's testimony became a turning point in the case. His statements were added to the evidence, further supporting the argument that Carter was not an isolated case but a product of a deeply flawed system. With Ryan's involvement, the case entered a new phase, and Carter began to feel the pressure more intensely than ever. His previous justifications started to crumble, leaving him increasingly cornered. After Ryan's testimony, Carter's case was no longer just about one individual. It became a symbol of the systemic injustices deeply rooted within the police force. Behind closed doors in the city's halls of power, meetings were held continuously. Pressure from the public, media, and human rights activists forced the government to take concrete action. David Johnson spent most of his time in his office, his desk piled high with documents. His assistant, Clara, entered with a grave expression. "Minister, I have news from the mayor's office. They want to meet with you to discuss a settlement." David frowned. "What kind of settlement?" Clara placed a document on his desk. "They're proposing to close the Carter case and issue a public apology to appease the public. In return, they want you to stop pushing for systemic reforms." David flipped through the pages, reading quickly but carefully. His face darkened. "Do they think I'll accept this? An apology is supposed to heal the injustices that countless people have endured." Clara hesitated. "The mayor is worried about the ongoing protests. If this drags on, the city could face significant economic losses." David stood up, his eyes filled with determination. "They don't understand that this is bigger than economic losses. This is an opportunity for real change, not just for my father, but for everyone." David decided to reject the settlement. He prepared for a long battle, ready to face the pressures from both the government and the legal system. As Carter's trial approached, tensions in the city reached a boiling point. Outside the courthouse, hundreds of protesters gathered, holding signs that read, "Justice for Walter," and "End racism in policing." This event was more than just a trial. It had become a symbolic battle for change. Inside the courtroom, Carter sat on the defendant's bench, his face etched with anxiety. Across from him was the legal team led by David. Reporters jostled for seats, while millions of others followed the proceedings via live broadcast. David began with a powerful opening statement. "Today, we are not only judging the actions of one individual. We are examining a system that has allowed injustice to thrive. The truth must be revealed, and justice must be served." One by one, the evidence was presented. The video recording of Carter's actions, Walter's testimony, and, most significantly, Ryan's confession painted a clear picture of abuse of power. Carter attempted to justify his actions, but his words could not counter the overwhelming evidence. Carter's defense lawyer argued that he was merely doing his duty and did not intend harm. However, David quickly refuted this claim. The duty of a police officer is to protect citizens, not impose prejudices upon them. Carter's use of force against an elderly man who posed no threat is a blatant violation of human rights. The courtroom buzzed with tension as the trial continued, every word and piece of evidence adding weight to the fight for accountability and systemic reform. During the multi-day trial, the truth about Carter gradually came to light. Detailed accounts of previous incidents he was involved in were presented. One of Carter's past victims, a black woman named Angela, took the stand to testify. She recounted an incident where Carter had abused his power while she was simply walking home after work. "When I tried to explain that I hadn't done anything wrong, he yelled at me and shoved me into the patrol car. I felt like I had no value, just because of the color of my skin," Angela said, tears streaming down her face. Testimonies like Angela's served not only as evidence against Carter, but also raised larger questions about the lack of accountability within the police system. David focused not only on Carter's actions but also on the systemic failures that had allowed such misconduct to go unchecked. As the trial progressed, Carter began to show signs of vulnerability. Under the weight of the court proceedings and the testimonies from witnesses, his confidence started to crumble. When asked if he regretted his actions, Carter remained silent for a long moment before finally replying, "I didn't think things would go this far. I was just doing what I thought was right." After days of deliberation, the court finally reached a verdict. Carter was convicted on charges of abuse of power, assault, and human rights violations. He was stripped of his position and sentenced to prison. As the sentence was read, a heavy silence filled the courtroom. Outside, the public celebrated the verdict. Cheers echoed through the streets. But for Carter, it was a bitter end. He had lost not only his career but also the trust of his family and society. Walter, though satisfied with the outcome, showed no signs of celebration. When David asked him how he felt, Walter simply replied, "I don't want anyone to suffer, not even him, but sometimes the truth needs to be revealed, and justice must be served." As this chapter concluded, the story was not just about the downfall of an individual but a wake-up call for an entire system. It underscored that change doesn't come from empty words but from genuine action and relentless struggle. After the trial, Walter received numerous invitations from organizations and individuals to attend interviews and community events to share his story. However, he declined most of them. For Walter, the goal was not to become a symbol of a movement but to find ways to help the community overcome deeply ingrained prejudices. One evening, when David came to visit, Walter sat in his old rocking chair in the living room, staring out the window with a distant look. He began to share memories of his past, painful ones he had never spoken about to anyone, not even David. "You know, David," Walter began, his voice thoughtful and reflective, "when I was young, I faced many of the same things you see today. Back then, I thought there was nothing I could do to change them." David stayed silent, listening intently. Walter recounted his childhood in a small southern town. During the 1950s and 1960s, racial segregation wasn't just cruel words, it was the law, a way of life. "I remember once, when I was just 12, I sat in the wrong seat on a bus. A policeman slapped me right there in the street. My mother stood and watched, tears streaming down her face, but she didn't dare intervene. She knew that if she fought back, we could lose much more." Walter paused, taking a deep breath as if to push away the painful memories. "As I grew older, I thought the world had changed. But the truth is, those prejudices just changed how they showed themselves. They didn't disappear. They just took on new disguises." David looked at his father, a wave of emotion welling up inside him. "Dad, you've endured so much, but I promise, I won't let future generations go through the same." Walter nodded, his gaze softening. "You've done well, David, but remember, the most important thing is to nurture compassion. No one is born hating another person." "Son." The Carter case sparked a powerful wave of reactions throughout the legal and law enforcement systems. Thanks to public pressure and David's decisive leadership, a series of reforms began to take shape. At the police department, visible changes were implemented. Officers were required to participate in cultural awareness and anti-racism training programs. An independent oversight committee was established to investigate complaints of police misconduct. More importantly, recruitment and promotion policies started emphasizing diversity and fairness. In a press conference, David declared, "We are not just punishing an individual. We are transforming a system to ensure that every citizen, regardless of skin color or status, is treated fairly." However, not everyone welcomed these changes. Some police officers, including those who had quietly supported Carter, felt threatened. They believed the reforms undermined police authority and made their jobs more difficult. This quiet resistance posed a significant challenge. But David understood that meaningful change required time and perseverance. Meanwhile, hope began to blossom in the community. Stories like Walter's were widely shared, inspiring many to stand up against injustice. Nonprofit organizations and human rights activists began collaborating with the government to launch educational programs aimed at fostering a more inclusive society. One morning, Walter received a letter from the prison where Carter was serving his sentence. The letter was handwritten, with clumsy but sincere words. "Mr. Walter, I don't know how to begin. I just want to say that I deeply regret what I did to you. When I joined the police force, I thought I would do the right thing. But in the end, I let prejudice and arrogance blind me. I don't expect your forgiveness, but I want you to know that I have realized my mistakes. Carter." Walter read the letter over and over, feeling the sincerity in each word. After several days of contemplation, he decided to visit Carter in prison. In the visiting room, Carter looked thinner and more worn out, He lowered his head when he saw Walter enter. Like a child caught in wrongdoing, Walter sat down across from him. His gaze no longer filled with anger but with compassion. "I read your letter," Walter began. "You've acknowledged your mistakes, and that's the first step." Carter looked up, his voice trembling. "I can't change what I've done, but I want to make amends. In any way I can." Walter nodded. "Making amends isn't easy, but you can start by learning to understand and respect others." The meeting ended in a meaningful silence. For Walter, forgiveness wasn't about forgetting. It was about freeing himself from the burden of resentment. A year later, the city seemed transformed. The reforms that had been implemented were beginning to show results. Community meetings were held regularly to foster mutual understanding between the police and residents. Victims who had once remained silent now bravely shared their stories, encouraging others to stand up for justice. Walter and David attended an event at Central Park, where people gathered to discuss peace and unity. Walter stood before the crowd, his voice warm but filled with strength. "Remember, change doesn't come from hatred. It comes from compassion, understanding, and an unwavering will to do what is right." The crowd erupted in applause. Beside Walter, David smiled. He felt proud, not just of his father, but of everything they had achieved together. The story ended with Walter standing amidst the crowd, his eyes filled with hope. Despite the arduous journey, he knew that the future could be brighter as long as people continued to fight for justice and humanity.